What big lessons did we learn in 2025, and what does it mean for the outlook for 2026 and beyond? I'm Russell Lamberti, Director and Chief Economist at Sakeliga. I'm joined today by my colleague and CEO, Piet le Roux. We're coming to you at the end of what has been a very interesting and very busy year, but also a very successful one for Sakeliga. And we want to thank the many great businesses that got behind our mission this year to create a favorable and flourishing business environment. We're going to look at 4 big lessons from 2025 and what they mean for the business environment and for the country. But perhaps you have additional lessons that you've learned from the year that's gone by. How did the big events of 2025 shape your thinking? Leave it in the comments below. We look forward to reading those. Let's get into it. Piet, it's fantastic to sit with you again as we bring 2025 to a close and look forward to what promises to be another fascinating year in this roller coaster of politics and economics and the work that we do here at Sakeliga. We decided to frame this conversation as let's try and understand what 2025 taught us. Rather than a review of what happened, what lessons did we actually learn? And we're gonna list 4. There's probably more, but we want to keep it also concise for this conversation. And so we're going to dive straight in. Lesson number 1, 2025 was a fascinating insight into how BEE became a lot more fashionable to criticize. But we also saw that you can really start pushing back against the third wave of BEE. We've described that third wave of BEE to our viewers several times. We've got an explainer video on what the third wave of BEE means and what that is. And for the first time this year, we got some validation that can actually be pushed back against. So let's unpack a little bit this idea of how fashionable it's become to criticize BEE and how we're seeing real wins against the outgrowth of BEE.
Russell, when BEE was at its height, let's say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was impossible to, in polite conversation, publicly state that BEE is a problem. Even especially at board level, think about that. What we've seen this year is well-known CEOs of different communities, different racial backgrounds in South Africa saying BEE is a big problem. We've seen acknowledgements in the political class that BEE is a problem. We've seen that op-eds are written against BEE, saying that there needs to be some kind of change. Now, we'll talk about why that's the shortcomings of that. But it's possible, and everybody agrees, that BEE is a massive problem. Some people want to tweak it. Some people want to remove it like we, because we think it's a very harmful policy. But it's certainly become reasonable and expected from fashionable people to acknowledge that BEE is a problem, or at least that there are substantial problems to it.
We've said this before, but it just bears repeating. Rewind the clock 10 years, perhaps even 5 years, but certainly 10 years ago. BEE was an untouchable idea. It was wrapped in lots of political baggage and just very difficult thing to talk about and criticize. Sakeliga has been doing that for a long time, since 2011. But it was not fashionable, and to your point, there's now a broad spectrum of people criticizing it. It's open season really for criticizing BEE. Now those criticisms come from different angles and different directions, but there's a fairly widely accepted understanding that BEE, in some sense, is not working, is either doing harm or is just not being effective in achieving some sort of goal. The president came out earlier, I think in 2025, and tried to defend BEE as being good for growth.
Yes.
That didn't get any traction. No one really latched onto that. That's not really a defendable position. It's very easy to show that that's not the case. So the knives are out for BEE in some way, shape, or form. I guess now the question is where does that terrain go next, and what does that negotiation, if you like, look like? And we intend to try and be as firm as possible as to the fact that we think this is harmful, needs to be stopped. Some people criticize BEE because they think we don't have enough of it.
Yeah, true. No, they just want BEE. They want more of it, just done right. But can something that's fundamentally misconceived or with so much internal contradiction, can something like that ever work? Our argument is no. Just today I had a conversation with a businessman who asked me when do we think will BEE end? which is a different question from asking, will it ever end? Or a different question from thinking that this is not even an askable question. This is how far things have shifted. People are now seeing that it's possible to have a non-BEE society. We're not there yet. There's some major tension lying ahead, but it's possible. So BEE has become delegitimized. And then secondly, we've helped with that by showing through our arguments publicly in what we communicate, but also in court papers, and through our victories earlier this year, where we actually had BEE licensing requirements for airlines reversed. And we've also subsequently launched another case on international airlines who are also now required to have BEE as a licensing condition. So we've already reversed a case this year. And I think that has proven to people that even though there are shortcomings in the legal system in South Africa, and even though courts are never completely politically independent from the state, it is possible to achieve meaningful pushback against something like BEE through the courts. And I'm glad to say that it's very enjoyable to be a part of this turning against BEE, and it's I'm very thankful to people who've helped support Sakeliga to this point where we're able to say today that we want to end BEE because it's a harmful policy, and that's a defensible position. It's a respectable thing to say, and it's actually, we've shown that it's possible through the courts and elsewhere.
So a fascinating first lesson, very encouraging. But let's look at lesson number 2 in our list, which is less encouraging, Piet. And that is that despite everything we've just said, and despite a much greater corporate pushback against BEE, and I think you're seeing that in not just the listed, prominent corporate space, but right the way through. And you're seeing even that in the way that companies are interacting with regulators like the Competition Commission, and extracting, in a sense, some concessions from the Competition Commission around race-based policy and so on. So there's a strong pushback. But in the negative, we've also seen this year an increased dedication, a marked increased dedication, potentially elicited by this strong opposition that's been emerging, but nonetheless a strong increased dedication to transformationism, to the full spectrum project of the ANC, of this government, which is to infuse race-restrictive policy across many spheres of society. There's a very clear escalation in that dedication to transformation, and we see this in several ways. Perhaps just sketch why we say that is a lesson from 2025.
Yes. So to emphasize that point, Russell, as much as we've simultaneously proven that it's possible to push back against BEE, so those so committed to it has, of course, needed to demonstrate and recommit themselves to adjustments. Now, what we've seen, the adjustments are first, we've seen more commitment in the Employment Equity Act. So we've seen the Act put in place, and together with NIASA, we've launched substantial litigation against the Employment Equity Act, which is basically requiring demographic representation at all levels in companies with 50 or more employees.
The most dramatic escalation in racial hiring quotas we've seen in this country.
Yes, so this is the 30 years high mark of intervention, race-based, race-restrictive intervention in who you can employ. And so that's passed. And we're fighting that, but it's the government's committed itself to that. Then we have seen the Expropriation Act being pushed through. Now, the Expropriation Act gets defended by things like that it's land reform and all about that. But in fact, it is an attempt at minority-targeted redistribution of land through non-market mechanisms and through increased state control.
At this stage, it seems inconceivable that a black landowner, for example, will get expropriated without compensation.
Yes,
We don't know for sure, but this is the direction that this seems to be
The
taken.
policy is intended. The policy may have other consequences, but the policy is intended against minority-owned land. And then we have seen despite our victory against third wave BE licensing in aviation, we've seen the necessity to increase our litigation. So we've rolled out additional court cases against BEE, and we have still some in store. For example, against the Property Practitioners Regulatory Authority, which is still committing itself to requiring BEE certificates and BEE compliance before you may participate as a property practitioner or a developer and so on. And we've seen other such expansions of BEE in whether you can get rebates on imports and exports. The Department of Trade and Industry has announced a transformation fund. So there are many examples, unfortunately, of a recommitment to BEE. Let me just say a final one. We've had even the Minister of Employment saying in Parliament that she will push transformation down the throat of those who oppose things like these racial hiring quotas, which is not a nice thing to say, and you only say that when you feel serious enough about it to not care whether people know what you're up to.
It's also an implicit admission that what you're trying to do is deeply opposed by normal businesses who realize what it takes to run a business day to day, and you don't do it off a race-determined spreadsheet or anything like that. That's just fantasy land. But that's elicited that comment. She's come out and said it in such an aggressive way. But interestingly, Piet, before you said that, I was just going to say that it is the rhetoric as well. So there's real policy, and then there's also real rhetoric. Even within the coalition government, we're seeing the DA and certain coalition partners kind of getting behind the ANC program. We've seen the leader of the DA, the Minister of Agriculture, John Steenhuisen, adopt that kind of framing and language of transformationism in really quite a full-throated defense of that earlier this year. And so this is not something that we're not picking up certainly from an executive, a central government perspective, and certainly not from Parliament. Any kind of tapping back, particularly in this, the rhetoric is quite spread out. It might differ in intensity for sure, but there's this seems to be quite a buy-in on this transformationist idea.
Yeah, and I guess looking back even 18 months ago when this current coalition government was formed, there was some expectation that the ministers who have policy discretion in many ways, that some DA ministers would exert that in, not outside of standard ANC policy. But someone like Mr. Steenhuisen has basically just repeated, he's signed under exact copies of his predecessors' policies. Now, so whether he's constrained or not, that's a discussion for another time. But what we've learned is that the coalition government itself has not helped turn the tide against BEE.
All right, so lesson one, there's pushback against BEE and successfully so. Lesson two, there's a dedication to the underlying policy of transformationism, the underlying structure of transformationism. Lesson three, let's leave policy for a little bit. Let's leave BEE policy for a little bit. We've seen in 2025 that alleviation from fairly catastrophic structural decline seems to be possible. There seems to be some kind of durability in some of the turnaround that we're seeing in Eskom, in some of the Transnet metrics, which have clearly recovered, some of the throughput at the ports in South Africa, and one or two other areas. That's manifested in better fiscal metrics, slightly better growth metrics, GDP. There's buoyancy there. That's just showing through at the margin in the mini budget in October. A slightly better story, underpinned even to some extent by some better macroeconomic management news, like the Reserve Bank actually lowering the inflation target, which is a very healthy development, even though it's fairly marginal at this stage, but it's a healthy development. And so all these things have kind of coalesced together to produce what looks like a kind of an alleviation in what before 2024 certainly was a rapid structural economic crisis. And we just think back to the stage, whatever it is, 10, 11, 12, 8, I forget, load shedding that was sweeping across the country for several years. The virtual disappearance almost of rail freight and passenger volumes and so on, the incredible dysfunction at the ports, which was getting farmers to completely tear their hair out. There seems to be some alleviation there, Piet. So this is a lesson from 2025. We can reflect back and go, it is possible to alleviate some of these very, very dire and rapid problems that were besetting the macroeconomy before then.
Yeah, and I think that points to some elements of realism, even though, as we've discussed earlier, there's deeply harmful and very strongly held ideological commitments within the ANC on their vision for society and social engineering and so on. It does show signs of realism. If you're willing to let private sector intervention weed out some of the corruption in Transnet and maybe add some management capacity to Eskom, although part of Eskom's recovery story is also just some, and this I think some good decision making within the ANC not to attach themselves to a green recovery of whatever nature, but just prioritize electricity in the grid.
Yeah.
And so there's some element of realism that I think combined with a effective corporate sector in many dimensions, when these two combine, it does offer a reprieve from a structural problem, and that may last. I mean, Russell, I should ask you to elaborate on this, but I think tied with a global emerging markets improvement, that does possibly give us a bit of a breathing room in the next few months or even years. Yeah,
I think it's an interesting one, and we'll maybe turn to this in more detail as we look forward.
All right.
But there's no question that for a number of months now in 2025, there's been buoyancy in the growth numbers, and we see it in the fiscal data, and there's some optimism as well, and you see it coming from someone like Adrian Enthoven, who gave a well-documented lecture, I think it was in Stellenbosch, pointing out some of these recovery dynamics that are going on, that are evidence, some green shoots, evidence of some green shoots and some alleviation in this decline. I think we've got to be careful though, because to your point, that's underpinned by a global story. It's not just a domestic story. So there's the gold and platinum prices have been very, very buoyant. The dollar is weakening, and so there's an emerging market, a little bit of an emerging market cyclical bull market story. Funds are flowing back towards emerging markets. There's the dollar is weakening, emerging market currencies are strengthening. That means bond yields are compressing somewhat as people buy South African government bonds. In 2025, the rand hasn't actually outperformed a number of other emerging market currencies, so this is a broader story as well. And so I think in a lecture like Mr. Enthoven gave, I think one's also just got to be a little bit careful to not read too much into some of these signs for two reasons. Number one, because there's global cyclical dynamics at play that can also, those cycles can turn. But I think number two, because some of these recoveries that we're seeing in some infrastructure management and so on are not, unfortunately, underpinned yet by fixes and repair in the more meaningful and structural problems that feed into those dynamics. How did those things break in the first place? So alleviating those problems, creating some reforms, creating some temporary fixes. We have to ask how sustainable those are if you're not dismantling at the same time the very, very strong and pervasive underlying political and transformationist structures that caused those things to break in the first place.
Right, I agree with that. I missed that a bit in his speech. I enjoyed reading his Mr. Enthoven's speech, but the full story needs to account for what brought us to what was a nosedive in many ways, and we're not, because of green shoots, we're not out of the nosedive. We just need to account for the whole thing so we can address the underlying causes.
Right. So lesson number 4 from 2025, and this is an interesting one. This has certainly been a very pervasive feature of 2025, right from the beginning of the year when Mr. Trump took office for a second term as President of the United States. And the big lesson, Piet, is that South Africa and American relations, SA-US relations, are going through a fundamental reset, very, very significant reset, certainly the largest we've seen in probably 30 odd years. That probably doesn't come as a big surprise to anyone. This has been all over the news for months and months. But this is, I think, the key lesson of this is that there is a reshaping of this relationship. And it seems to us, and we'll get into this as we look forward, but it seems to us that we're just at the start of a orientation of how foreign policy vis-a-vis America is going to work. And so you've been thinking a lot about this, but this is significant, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. This is a big moment in SA-US relations.
Yeah, let's compare. I want to compare what the US relationship to South Africa means to our domestic situation. But let's start with just the US. We've assessed, Russell, that despite what the government has been saying over this past year, that there's no imminent reset possible. The US has made demands clear in various ways, which boil down to they want better local policy on the economic front. They want the mismanagement of the multicultural situation in South Africa addressed. They see a targeted negative measures against Afrikaners. That's how Mr. Trump frames it. And that can be expanded because there are targeted negative measures against many groups in this country, but certainly the Afrikaners as well. And then they've said that they want exemptions from BEE for themselves, for US companies. Makes complete sense. And I suspect we'll see more of that from the European Union. That's certainly what we're hearing behind the scenes, not in front of the cameras, but there's a very broad dissatisfaction with the kind of BEE requirements that international organizations face coming into South Africa.
Can I just pause on that, because I know you want to flow into other things, but I just want to put a highlighter over that dissatisfaction with the domestic policy environment in South Africa is not just a US story. The US is, under the leadership of Mr. Trump, of course, has been much more vocal about it, very, very bold and kind of, in a sense, aggressive about it. The Europeans and other foreign missions from Asia and from around the world operate with somewhat more discretion, perhaps approach it more delicately. But in our interactions with them, it's quite clear, Piet, that there's not just dissatisfaction, grave concern at the shape that some policies are taking in this country.
Right. Yes. And so the Donald Trump shakeup has brought that to the fore, made it clear. But I think the change in the US with regard to South Africa is not so much that for the first time US interests are developing with regard to South Africa. Those interests have been there, but they are articulated differently. And I think that's also why the US attention is going to go away. The US has an interest in a stable South Africa for stability in sub-Saharan Africa. The US has an interest because of for other global and geopolitical reasons, and it has an interest for access for its businesses into South Africa. And it's afraid that its adversaries will move in for whatever reason. But part of it is that the US is, for the first time, but maybe this is part of the change, is recognizing more explicitly the multicultural nature of the South African social environment, which has been downplayed over the past 30 years. As a nation, part of a domestic nation-building story, but also part of what was a global Western approach to international affairs, which was to, and I mean, you can even
to
see
cultural affairs.
To cultural affairs, you can see this in some of the U.S. Foreign policy interventions in the Middle East. There was lots of talk about exporting democracy all over the world, but there's been a reversal of some of those cultural imperial projects, and more of a realist assessment of variation between groups.
Are you referring to this idea of turning a small Middle Eastern country into some replica of American society?
Give them a handbook and some training, and then very soon you'll have a little United States in Arabia somewhere.
Give them a constitution and one man, one vote and free democracy, and suddenly you'll get something different. Which
is a combination of impractical, harmful, and disrespectful. But it's not. I don't want to single the US out for having committed this mistake Arguably, this was a general Western emphasis on what people share. Everybody shares something, and what the US, and to an extent lagging behind the US developments. You see some of this in Europe as well. A reappreciation of meaningful differences between cultures over the world. Now, someone like Huntington, which was a political scientist or historian, would speak about the clash of civilizations and define lots of geopolitical developments and how civilizations clash. But you and I know, and as we know in South Africa, there's also lots of civilizational cooperation. So I think what's just different now compared to 10 years ago, worldwide, but it affects South Africa particularly because we are a society with lots of difference. And it's as if we now realize that the challenge is how to not ignore that, but find ways of cooperation instead of clash. And now, of course, what Mr. Trump's doing is pointing that out in his particular style. It's causing quite a bit of unease. But it's going to stay not only on his side. There is a general change to, I think, thinking about social cooperation and difference. And it's probably going to be with us for the next few decades.
All right, so those are 4 salient lessons that we've taken from 2025. There's almost certainly more. We have to cap it at something like that, and those are what strike us as interesting and important, and certainly relevant to our work. People may, in the comments section, put their own lessons from 2025 as the world's taken shape over the last year. There's been some fascinating developments in many respects, so share your thoughts with us there. But let's stick with the US now as we move into the outlook. Let's look at 2026 and beyond. Given these lessons and given what we've just spoken about, what do we think that means going forward? And the first factor that we'd like to discuss for 2026 and beyond is, given what we've just discussed about the resetting of diplomatic relations and the shape that that's been taking, very obviously in the last few months and even few days with the G20 and the news that Mr. Trump has disinvited or uninvited South Africa from the next year's G20 and so on. So there's real tension, and what we see here is U.S. diplomatic escalation as we look out towards next year. Now, Piet, let's try and paint a picture of what that can mean and can look like. What does escalation look like in this respect?
Yeah, escalation is a foreign policy isolation, which is what this non-invitation to the G20 means. It possibly also means less trade with the US, which is what you get if you increase trade barriers in form of tariffs or other non-tariff barriers, reciprocal tariffs as the US refers to them. It's just important to note that South Africa actually has some unilateral trade inhibiting measures against the United States. Just today I had a look at some rebates on polystyrene, which is based on compliance with employment equity. Now, US companies aren't going to be complying with employment equity, and so you could argue that there are many non-tariff barriers unilaterally imposed by South Africa on SA-US trade. Chicken rebates are another example. Wine imports, exports are another example. So that escalation means that you have less trade, and that probably means something for GDP numbers. I think estimations, you could say plus minus 1%. Could be more, could be less. But if a significant dent in US-South Africa trade means a little bit for it's not a complete disaster, but it is meaningful on a growth short country like South Africa. But you would have some ideas as well, Russell.
Well, Piet, let me just keep going down this road here and say, before we even talk too much about escalation, let's just back up a little bit. And you've spent some time, both of us have, but more so you have spent some time engaging with think tanks in places like Washington, some policymakers and people who think about these things in Washington. Why does the US want to escalate? What are its interests here? How can we start to kind of put flesh on the bones of American interests in South and Southern Africa? We don't have to, that's a huge conversation, of course, but let's maybe just sketch out some of the parameters of how America is thinking about this region in ways that might be specific to the Trump administration, but that also perhaps transcend the Trump administration, that could be durable across different administrations in America. Why Southern Africa? Why should America care? Is I suppose the question.
Yeah, and the reason why we would ask that question is because it helps us anticipate further possible actions by the US and how we could steer those or capitalize on those in productive manners. For me, the US interest in South Africa boils down to three things, with a fourth thing specifically for the Trump administration. Let's start with the final one. The fourth thing that's specific to the Trump administration is probably the symbolic interest of South Africa. The Trump administration has basically just said, completely turned the tide on DEI, which it calls diversity, equity, inclusion. And from its perspective, if you try and explain BEE or employment equity or these other race restrictive matters from a South African perspective to a US company or to a US politician, they see it as DEI. So you have an administration that says that's a very harmful policy domestically, it's a harmful policy worldwide, and they want to act against it. And then you look all around the world and you see who's doing a lot of it, and then you see, well, you hit the global capital of DEI right here around Pretoria, South Africa. And so that's a particular interest. So that symbolic importance is going to stay, and Mr. Trump's eye isn't going to go away from this thing standing out for it around the world. Then there are three that's probably a little bit more durable. Not that the first one isn't, but let's look at the other three. The first is geopolitical, where South Africa is on the map, and who it aligns with on voting at international fora and so on against the US, normally as in general, much more than other countries. Then secondly, there is the business interest. There's all this talk of critical minerals, but there are other reasons as well why it's in the US interest as a global power to have its businesses operating all around the world. And
just quickly, even on critical minerals, it's not just about, I need your minerals. It's about, can companies actually come in and invest and develop and provide the technology to capitalize on those opportunities? It's all that.
Can US companies be part of a growth story in Africa or not?
Exactly.
And whether South Africa welcomes them or not matters.
Yeah.
Because it's still by far the most advanced financial markets infrastructure gateway into Africa. You can talk about all of those things. And then the third is a less known but increasingly prominent story. We've identified it earlier in this year, and it's now come out in some tweets, and I think it will be a story to stay, which is that there's a migration importance. What happens to South Africa matters for economic prosperity in sub-Saharan Africa. This is not I'm not exaggerating here when I say that the fresh produce going from the Johannesburg market goes up right thousands of kilometers every day up into other parts of Africa.
We're told that fresh produce finds its way into Tanzania.
Right, and that's not the only thing that gets exported from here. And so much of the stability of sub-Saharan Africa relies on what's happening in South Africa.
Technology, capital, products, businesses investing in African countries. South Africa is a really, really significant hub for that, and kind of provides that anchor of stability for the subcontinent. It's
and part of how you know this is true is if you look around the cityscapes, metropolitan scapes of South Africa, and even in some of the small towns, who do you see there? In the last 20 years, there's been a massive migration story into South Africa.
Yeah.
And you see unease with this among black people of historic residence and presence in South Africa, objecting to these newcomers, which are also black. So from a worldwide perspective, it doesn't look like there's a change in South Africa. But we know that there are incredible tensions in some parts of Pretoria, could be called Little Nigeria, and that's not. It's just the reality. And this tension is going to stay with us. Now, the point is, from a US perspective, if South Africa is not attractive anymore to a sub-Saharan migration story, this is also important for the Europeans. Then that migration starts moving in other directions, and so that's why it's important. I was at some business meetings with this G20 thing now, and there were no US people, of course, around the table, but there were European people around the table, especially around the Mediterranean Sea. And these businessmen said one of the reasons they think it's very important to be present in South Africa and why they're encouraging their governments to be involved here is to ensure that this is an economic success story to maintain and contain an African migration story so that there's rather a success here than the economic vluchtelingen, what's the word? Economic
migrants,
economic migrants and immigrants and refugees going elsewhere in the world. And those are stable, durable reasons for why the US would be interested. And can I say something where I think this will head? So that's the interest, but where can this go? I think one of the constraints probably in US policymaking towards South Africa is this. If you look at the underlying interests, if you act in a way towards South Africa that makes the country go economically top, if you take GDP growth away from the country, you're actually harming your own interests in some ways. Now, the US could weigh its trade-offs and decide that's worth it. But I think it would be searching, and we should be trying to anticipate ways in which entities like the United States can look for exertions of pressure, means of levers on South Africa that doesn't harm its long-term interests, and that we will see. I think we must look for ways in which there will be some kind of differentiation, maybe some special pressure on BEE as one of the core things that threaten those interests, not only for DEI reasons but for economic stability in South Africa.
So certainly just a huge space to watch, and the G20 news in the last few days is substantial. And I think the one lesson to just take from that is, the Trump administration is acting pretty aggressively here. This is saying to South Africa, you don't have a seat at the table in this forum anymore. Now, we might think that forum is not particularly useful internationally. Maybe it's a bit of a talk shop. Who knows quite how effective the G20 is, but it's a big move. And I think you were saying off air, Piet, is just given that America is willing to start behaving in this way towards South Africa, we should keep the cone of possibilities open as to what escalation can actually look like, and we shouldn't just assume that it's going to be incremental necessarily or just kind of steady as she goes. There's potentially a number of things that could start to play out, and we have to keep a really strong eye on those things. Second factor as we look forward, Piet. So we spoke in the first section. Two of our lessons pertain to BEE. The one was the pushback, the successful pushback. The other one was the increased dedication to transformation. There's a third thing that we'd like to talk about going forward, and that is what we're calling a tactical adjustment to transformationism. A year ago, we sat in the same seats here, and we suggested that looking forward, there was going to be an escalation in BEE and in transformation, an escalation both in policy, and we were seeing it. It wasn't so much a prediction; it was what we were seeing.
And it came through.
And in opposition. So the opposition is going up, and the policies are escalating. Now, as we sense things right now, and as we look forward, we might be seeing a bit of a tactical maneuver from the government and from policymakers and so on. What we're thinking of as a tactical adjustment, perhaps a little bit of a assessment of the balance of forces, that there is so much opposition. Sakeliga is getting success in
Very
courts.
Consciously, this opposition has been scaled up.
It's been scaled up, and so are we seeing, Piet, as we look forward, a sort of tactical retreat from BEE, a little bit of a toning down as the government regroups in some respects?
I think regrouping is the right word for this. And we've seen this in I think, especially now toward the latter part of this year, with BEE becoming so delegitimized from so many quarters across communities and internationally, that we've seen some apparent introspection. I don't think that goes very deep, but someone like Park Stow, the Minister of Trade and Industry, just recently announced that there will be a review of BEE policies. But he goes to many lengths to emphasize that this is not taking a step away from BEE. This is to make sure that the social engineering attempts actually happen. He's deeply committed to, but there's concern that it might be so opposed and that the balance of forces may turn against it, that in order to pursue it, it needs to regroup. That's what we're seeing now.
It's almost like a re-legitimization project underway at the moment.
Yeah, because it's become it's not credible anymore to say that BEE is a good thing. So there needs to be a regrouping. I think that's testament to a lot of the success on our side and other people. And in general, the thing has just become so unwinded that there is a regrouping underway. I think that's one of the reasons why we don't see so much movement on the Expropriation Act. So even though it's signed, it's not operational yet. It's been signed in clandestinely in December last year, then announced in January of 2025 that it has been signed, caused a lot of hoo-ha. Then later this year, we announced and we publicized the Driefontein expropriation, which is urban land in Boksburg, east of Johannesburg. We showed that there's actual attempts at, not an attempt, there has been expropriation without compensation. The only attempt remaining is where the compensation can be drawn from that city council, which is still an open question. Looks good, but it's still an open question.
Will be before the High Court.
Yeah, but we know that the ANC is deeply committed to expropriation without compensation and substantially under market value as a means for what it calls land reform and for urban reform. And why hasn't it moved so much on that this year? And I think we have seen a little bit of a regrouping there, and we may see a little bit of a hesitation even going into the next year or two, because so much attention is currently on it. I think it makes much tactical sense from an ANC perspective to re-legitimize BEE. Once that's set up with transformation funds, better codified things that we can't attack so easily in court, maybe re-legitimized it in the public mind, then it's the next step could be reassessing the application of the Expropriation Act.
Pete, just expand a little bit on this idea of the government trying to potentially improve codification. How have we exposed some weaknesses there, and how might they try to counteract that? I think that's an interesting little idea to briefly explore.
Well, what many of the current third wave BEE policies rely on actually front-running, being ahead of the curve of where the underlying legislation actually allows the bureaucrats to go. And that's allowed us to win this case in the airlines licensing case, because there's actually no underlying legislation that allows for making BEE certificate a precondition for an airline service license. And that's why we have very good prospects on winning the international airlines licensing case. It's also why we have good prospects on winning the property practitioners BEE case for developers and estate agents, requiring a BEE certificate for them to operate. And a number of, it's also actually the basis for why we won that big procurement case 2.5-3 years ago against Treasury, when Pravin Gordhan's regulations went ahead of where the legislation actually allowed him as a minister to go. And he attempted to make it possible for state entities to pre-exclude people based on BEE. So we've been relying on that legislative front-running, that ultra vires conduct to win our cases, and we will keep winning cases based on those. Now, from a sharp legal perspective, you don't have to be very sharp to see this. One of the obvious ways to remedy this, if you're committed to getting BEE through and keeping going with it, then you just try and correct the underlying legislation, and then make a stronger move. So that's part of regrouping. It's just shoring up your base and then moving again.
I must say, just before we move on to the next issue, is that following on very closely from what you've just said is the Competition Commission, and how we've been able to see how they've changed behavior in recent six or 9 months or so, because they are emblematic of a little regulatory bureaucracy, let's say, that really kind of shoots from the hip, acts in arbitrary ways, and we can show this in data. And as part of this theme of regrouping, we've seen that when companies push back against Comcom requirements in large mergers and acquisitions and large corporate deals, the Competition Commission tries to put all kinds of race restrictions on these deals. Companies have been pushing back, so that hits one of our lessons from the year. There's been a strong pushback, and what we're seeing is this
Tactical
retreat. The Competition Commission seems to be approving far more deals. This is we can see this in the data with fewer conditions. So it's acceding to some of the counter demands from companies. Actually, let this deal go ahead. Don't put so many demands on us, and the Comcom is kind of letting these things go through. So just another data point on a very interesting development that at the moment seems to be something that I think we can expect to see going forward into 2026 as well. The last factor that we'll look at, and before we just talk about some of our own work, but as we look into next year, is again, picks up on some of the themes we've discussed already from our lessons, is this kind of cyclical recovery that South Africa seems to be experiencing. As I said, the growth numbers are a little bit buoyant. The fiscal numbers are a little bit better. But we see this against what we see as quite a bearish, quite a negative structural backdrop. And so just like in any business cycle, right, when things are good and times are buoyant and credit is flowing and businesses are making money, it's incumbent upon good entrepreneurs to assess that situation and try and assess and make provision for the fact that those times are not going to last forever. To try and delineate between and distinguish between cyclical, short-term cyclical froth, let's say, and real structural trends. And sometimes if the structural trend is also going up, then that's good. But sometimes you can have a cyclically positive situation where structurally underlying growth dynamics are actually not really improving that much. And I think this is one way that we need to think about where South Africa is right now until we see kind of really meaningful, deep reform of the transformationist agenda, the what we might even think of as domestic sanctions on certain groups of people. If you entrench those deeply in this economy, it's very hard to talk about structural recovery beyond really just what looks like a short-term stabilization.
We've been so used to zero growth or negative real growth for so many years now, and underperformance, that it's wonderful to have the alleviation of some tactical regrouping internally and then a global tailwind story. But we shouldn't now expect maybe a 2% or a 3%. What should have happened in this is if you remove the underlying structural problems, you're going to shoot the lights out. Then you grow at 5%, 10% GDP numbers, which is what a country like South Africa the numbers should look like if the structural problems are removed. You mentioned their targeted sanctions. I want to distinguish here. So people are concerned, rightly, about what a hostile U.S. Economic policy could mean for South Africa. But it means maybe plus minus 1%, maybe less, maybe more. It's a 1% GDP.
We're talking about tariffs and
we're talking about tariffs and trade barriers and maybe it's even more if the U.S. really pulls her rabbit out of the hat or something. But
and turns the screws on the financial sector and put scrutiny over
maybe some debt, some government debt flows and so on. So it can increase, but we're talking maybe a 1%. That's what's in the realm now. That's not what causes the problems in South Africa. South Africa isn't a 1% percentage point GDP underperforming country. It's multiples of that. And the reason for that is, in contrast to the threat of international sanctions, the targeted domestic sanctions, which is what BEE is, which is what transformationism is, which is what employment equity is, which is what land expropriation is, which is even what some of the other things that make minority groups in this country uncomfortable and drive them away, things like interventions at school level, whether they can teach their children in the language of their choice, whether they can send their children to hospital or themselves or their parents and so on. Once the government interventions are so targeted, and let's just regroup on so often so race targeted in just BE and employment equity and comms matters, that this is causing several percentage points annually. So the targeted domestic sanctions by this country's government against some of this country's citizens is what is one of the major causes of the underperformance. And unless we find a way to address that, then we will not properly recover and we will not have a flourishing society. So in looking ahead for the next few years, if the little bit of the emerging market improvements gives us breathing room, and if some of the tactical regrouping on the government side amid the delegitimization of BEE and transformationism helps us, then it's an important time to shore up the effort against BEE on business side in South Africa. We're not going to keep getting chances all after each other. Yeah. Sometimes countries really go bust, but we have time, but not inevitable. We don't have infinite time.
Excellent, and I think critical points there, Piet, because this is essentially how we advise thinking about what this present period of economic buoyancy, let's say, is it's not a time for complacency, and it's not a time for thinking things have turned the corner, but rather an opportunity to do what, and let's just talk about how we want to use this opportunity. Let's start with litigation. We are on the process of rapidly ramping up our strategic litigation against harmful policy, and we're not stopping. This needs to carry on. So let's talk through that and some of the other important dynamics of how we intend to use this opportunity over the next year and beyond.
Yeah, we'll hit possibly this year about a dozen cases running at some point during this past year.
Concurrent
cases ranging from BEE and transformation to matters of local intervention in areas like the Tsibota town intervention, to differences between when something is a tax, or whether it can or a tariff internally, Expropriation Act, NHI, employment equity. These are all major cases with potentially billions of upside for the economy that we are running very efficiently with a specialized engine. And we think we need to double and triple that over the next few years. So we're going to keep at that. But litigation is not solving everything. We've discussed this in some of our other podcasts, and viewers are welcome to check those out. But we also need to take some what we call alternative structures or implement alternative measures. And Russell, hand it back over to you.
Well, thanks, Piet. Very important on the litigation side, but that's not all that we're focused on. And one of the key areas is that we've been engaging with foreign trade missions and trade attaches, and helping them understand the policy environment domestically, think clearly about the threats that the businesses face from the countries that they represent. So what do we intend to do as we look ahead to a year of potential significant escalation in US-SA diplomatic relations and all the dynamics we've discussed? What do we intend to do in relation to foreign trade missions and foreign embassies?
Yes, given the persistence of the international attention on South Africa for the next few years, I think that it would be our role to strengthen these relationships at a trade level, at an economic level, with foreign missions, but also with foreign businesses operating in South Africa. And it's important. States, Russell, are strong entities, and their interests in ensuring that South Africa treats their businesses well, serves or at least not harm their geopolitical interests, do not cause a destabilization in sub-Saharan Africa. Those are all strong and persistent and likely to increase interests. And that means that they are likely, with or without Sakeliga, with or without anyone in South Africa, they are likely to adjust their foreign policy towards South Africa, attempting to steer South Africa in directions that they feel is good. And that inevitably will include lessening of BEE and transformationism, because it's obviously harmful, and they
demands
know
for that.
They will demand
requirements for that.
Yes, their policy measures will tend to be against transformationism because they know it's destructive, and it's become delegitimized. So it's now easier, even at a diplomatic level. And they also are interested in ensuring that South Africa is an economic success story. They don't want a collapsed sub-Saharan Africa. And part of ensuring that South Africa is economically successful is ensuring that minority groups in South Africa, which are currently facing targeted domestic sanctions, are treated better and are welcomed in the country. Whereas, of course, politicians currently deny that they are making it an unwelcome place for white people and Western people in South Africa. Even to another extent, also Indian people don't always have it easy in South Africa. Colored people sometimes feel excluded. In some of the employment equity regulations, we saw quotas maximum on Indian people and colored people. That's been like part of that tactical retreat now. But some of that's bound to come back. And unless we find a way for minority groups in South Africa to be well treated, economically respected, and their property rights to be maintained, which is essential for this whole region and this whole country and everybody else to experience an economic improvement as well, we're going to have a problem. And I think the opportunity for Sakeliga is to help articulate how the interests of everyone in South Africa, from a business perspective, aligns with what is possible to exert at an international policy level, policy pressure level towards South Africa. And if we can improve the quality of that policy pressure, and if we can leverage that internally for reform, we'll be making a major change and a major improvement, a major contribution to a stable economic and flourishing society here.
Piet, there's something we haven't spoken about that's happening next year that a lot of people will be thinking about next year, and that is the municipal elections, the local government elections. Now, we don't know who's going to win what, and we don't know how that's going to go. What we can say is between now and those elections, which are about a year from now, decaying municipalities are likely to continue decaying. Mismanagement is likely to continue. And even after those elections, many municipalities will not have a positive change in administration and will continue to decline. And even the ones that do have some positive changes in administrations might enter into very messy coalitions, and we've actually seen that can sometimes go worse for at least for a period of time. So whatever those elections might say about the broader political trajectory of certain parties as we look forward to national elections beyond that, between now and then and beyond, our critical work in trying to solve this very tricky puzzle of how to get recovery going on in towns will also continue. And I think this also just loops back to this idea, as much as we see some buoyancy in the economic numbers, on the ground in some of these small towns, there just remains really, frankly, a structural deep depression, economic depression going on.
Right. There's a possibility that the Iron Lady takes charge of Johannesburg, and that will cause all sorts of distress for some and all sorts of optimism for others. But anyone willing to take on a collapsing metropolitan like Johannesburg is up for a very difficult task. And so I think I'd echo what you say, Russell. The important thing for Sakeliga is to figure out how we can coordinate capital in a professional but also firm manner, directed toward litigation to reform what is possible through the courts, but then also in the form of alternative structures, alternative private sector-driven interventions, which is part of the current improvement. And
that's tackling things like infrastructure, all the way through to security problems, right, so on. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's where what the road looks like ahead for Sakeliga. It's not getting caught up in the changes at local political or national political level, working with them as they are, because there will always be in whatever political arrangement at a state level or at a municipal level, there will be parts of it that are easy to work with and better and exercises good judgment, and there will be parts of it that are purely sectionally interested and doing foolish things or being too ideologically driven. And I think the challenge for us would to find that balance between just developing and reforming where we can through the courts, and then coordinating the network we've built up and the resources we can allocate to alternative interventions, capitalizing on the good political developments and compensating for the bad ones.
Well, thanks, Piet. And what we've hit on there really is an opportunity. We can see that the state is engaged in a tactical regrouping on its transformationist agenda. And we've also got some economic buoyancy that has reversed what was a precipitous macroeconomic trend for several years. And that creates an opportunity, and one that we intend to take to the fullest possible extent. And I want to thank our supporters in 2025 who've really helped us make this possible. We've been overwhelmed by the tremendous upsurge in support from great businesses around this country. And we invite you who maybe have not partnered with Sakeliga to join us in 2026 and beyond to help shape a flourishing business environment, to help create economic order. If you want to do that, head over to our website to find out more and get involved. Thank you so much for joining us.